how has your personal experience being a professor and researcher in this impacted how you see climate change as an issue and as a global phenomenon that needs to be addressed?
Yeah, I mean, I probably in a huge way. I mean, just because since I study this for a living, right, I know it in a lot more detail than maybe, someone who's just reading about it in the media. In particular, I think I maybe have more of an appreciation for what is really scary about it and what is maybe not as scary as what's sort of out there in the media. And I think when you know so much more about all the different types of impacts, right, you get a little bit more of a perspective on it. And I can go into more detail, later, but I think that's maybe the biggest thing, that being a professor as opposed to just being someone out there makes a difference, right? So I'm a little bit better. Maybe that sounds a little bit too.
No, that makes sense.
But I know more about like which impacts are a bigger deal than others. Let's say.
So you know how a lot of people claim climate change is a hoax, that kind of stuff, especially with politics.
Right.
Do you know some ideas that we can use to address that and try to get more public information out about this issue?
I don't know. I think that most sources out there, no matter what their politics, will say that the climate is changing right now. I think where the difference comes down to is you'll have more of the mainstream outlets saying that it is because of human activities, where you have maybe some other outlets saying it's all just because of a natural cycle. It's not because of human activities. What I don't tend to see anymore is outlets actually saying it's not happening. Right? Instead, what you see much more is people saying like the idea that it's because of people is a hoax. That's a little bit different. Right. So I think everybody agrees it's happening. Planet's warming up, right? It's really clear in the data the planet's warming up. It's been warming up for about 100 years. And again, where this idea of it being a hoax comes in is people trying to claim that it's not because of people doing it, right? That it's just nature doing it. The idea that people's doing it is a hoax. But the scientific perspective is that it is because of what people are doing. And at least the way that I talk about it to audiences is that there are lots of natural variations to climate too, right? It's both and, right? Natural variations are happening, and people, by burning fossil fuels and putting CO2 in the air, are warming up the planet as well. But that actually the effect of the natural cycles would have been actually the planet slowly cooling. The Earth has been in a natural cooling cycle for thousands and thousands of years, since about the end of the last ice age ended about 10,000 years ago, where we rapidly warmed up ending about 10,000 years ago out of that last ice age. And then since maybe about 10 or 8,000 years ago, the planet's just sort of been very slowly cooling off naturally, as we would have, the natural cycles would have been taking us into the next ice age over a period of many, many, many thousands of years. And then all of a sudden, that slow natural cooling got interrupted right when we started burning a lot of coal and oil and natural gas around 150 and especially 100 years ago. So yes, it's both and, right? There's natural changes in climate and people are changing climate, right? But this current warming has got to be due to people, right? Because the natural cycle would have been to slowly cool us off, right? We were going to be naturally going into the next ice age in another several thousand years, right? Not in our lifetimes, right? But we were slowly headed there. And the reason why now we're rapidly warming up instead of slowly cooling down, right, is because we're not seeing the natural cycle anymore, right? We're seeing the effect of all of that CO2 that we have put into the air, right? We're burning a lot of fossil fuels, right? Those fossil fuels are made of carbon, so when they burn, they become CO2. The CO2 enters the air, the CO2 stops the Earth's heat from escaping to space, right? Just like putting on a blanket, and it warms us up. So I would say, yes, of course, the climate changes naturally, but that doesn't mean that what's happening now is because of the natural cycle, right? It can't be. The natural cycle would have been cooling us off, not warming us up, right? And what we're doing right now is warming rapidly.
I see. That's really, that's right. A great perspective on it, I think.
Yeah.
Now, I saw that you had some research about the Holocene epoch and how you were looking at paleoclimate.
This project is still happening, right? I think I wrote this text like 2 years ago, but this project is still happening. So this is mostly not my project, right? So my colleague in the department, Pat Fall, is a Bronze Age archaeologist who studies archaeology in the Middle East and is very interested in how ancient natural climate change, right, back then, right? This was before the discovery of coal, oil, natural gas and stuff, but these ancient kind of natural cycles that we were talking about, how they may have affected the rise and fall of civilizations back then in the Bronze Age, like, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years ago. Really, I'm getting the wrong dates for the Bronze Age. I'm not an archaeologist myself. So that's really her project, and I'm sort of the climate person on that. So I'm providing to that team sort of some information about what those natural climate changes, especially natural rainfall changes, natural precipitation changes back then during the Bronze Age might have looked like, and whether, and then they were going to be thinking about whether those could explain why certain civilizations rose and fell when they did. So I'm kind of more just the climate person on that broader archaeology or history project.
Do
That's a pretty minor piece of my research. The big stuff that I do is the stuff further up the page, right, about how climate change is affecting today, is affecting drought and water scarcity and whether places have enough water, right, and rainfall patterns and river flow and things like that today. That's really my main research focus. And how climate change is affecting weather extremes today as well.
So a little bit more about your research. What is like an intriguing research topic or project that you've been working on lately that you'd like to speak a little bit about?
Yeah, so I actually have a few interesting things going right now. So maybe my biggest current project right now, so I have one doctoral student right now, one PhD student, and so for her PhD, she is working on a project that's sort of to elaborate on what I was just sort of said just before that question. So we're very interested in my research group in this question of how is climate change, how is global warming changing the availability of water for human and plant use. In particular, are there places where climate change might lead to like water supplies dwindling, right, or plants dying from lack of water? Are there places where climate change is going to lead to water scarcity? And on the other hand, are there places where climate change is going to lead to more water, right, for people and plants and so forth, right? People and plants have an easier time with water availability issues. We don't really tend to think about this very much here in the Southeast, right? Everybody's got plenty of water in the Southeast, right? Our problem in the Southeast is we just saw with Hurricane Helene, it's often too much water. But in a lot of the rest of the world, right, that's a really big deal, right? In the Western U.S., it's all about, are we going to have enough water to grow our crops? Are we going to have enough water, right, for people to use in cities? Or are we going to have water restrictions, right? In the Middle East and China, same things, right? There are places where they're worried always about, are we going to have enough water? So that's much more what my research is about. So it's broadly, how is climate change making water scarcity worse in some places? Is it ameliorating it in some places? What is the effect of climate change on that? So what this PhD student of mine, Grace Mazaleski, what she's actually working on is trying to tackle this long-standing question about whether you need to account for things other than rainfall changes when you answer that question. Because sort of, you might imagine, okay, so the planet warms up, and if that makes it rain more in some places, then probably they're going to have more water supplies. And if it makes it rain less in other places, right, then they're going to have less water supplies, right, because all the water in the rivers and in the groundwater and in the trees, comes from rain. So you might just think it's about rainfall changes, but then there's this whole school of thought that says, it's not just about rainfall, because like, what if you have somewhere where the planet's warming up, maybe it rains a little bit more because the planet's warming up, but the air is hotter, and because the air is hotter, that evaporates the water faster off of the surface, and so even though it's raining more, people and plants don't necessarily actually get to keep more water because the hotter air makes the water disappear faster, and so we need to account for this hotter air temperature as well. And then there's some other things too. So there's air temperature, rainfall or precipitation is the main one, right? But there's the school of thought says we have to think about air temperature and its effect on evaporation too. And then other folks saying things like we actually have to think about like how the rain falls, right? If the rain falls in these very, very intense bursts, maybe it's going to give a lot of water to the rivers, like what we're seeing right now with Hurricane Helene, but it's not going to give very much water to the plants because the plants won't have a chance to. So we need to like account for that. So this broad question that my PhD student is trying to answer is, to what extent do we have to worry about things other than rainfall when we're thinking about how climate change affects water supplies? Is it just, if we look at, say, like very long-term trends in river flow, right, say for the last half century, the last century, however long we have records, does it really seem like everywhere that it's been raining more over time, we've been having more water in the rivers over time? Or is it more complicated than that? Like, are there actually places where it's been raining more over time, we don't have more water in the rivers over time, right? Implying that it's maybe one of these other factors is important. So that's really what she's looking at. She's trying to go through like reams of global data, right? Trying to answer that question of like, do real world river flow changes or maybe vegetation changes just look like precipitation changes? Or are there really interesting differences? And we have to think about things other than precipitation, like temperature and what plants are doing, right? And the way in which the rain falls and stuff, rather than just rainfall totals. So she's got this big, years-long project to answer that question. She's just getting started with.
That's very interesting.
Yeah,
that is I've never considered it that way, how there's a lot of other factors besides rainfall that just impact
right.
that.
Yeah, no, it's huge. I mean, so one example you can think about with this, one that I always like to use when I'm teaching my classes. So think about, I don't know how much of you like sort of been around the U.S. or sort of visited different places in the U.S.?
Not much.
Not much,
Yeah.
maybe a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, this will be interesting. Okay, so which place do you think of as being a drier environment, right? Somewhere with less water to go around? Detroit, Michigan, or Austin, Texas?
Austin.
Right. So everybody answers Austin, but actually Austin gets more rain per year than Detroit.
Wow.
It's just that it's way hotter out there, and the air is way drier, and it's way sunnier, right? And so that water disappears from the ground much faster, right, than the water in Detroit. So even though Austin actually gets a little bit more rain than Detroit, Austin's environment is way drier than Detroit's, right? Because the air in Austin's warmer, the sun in Austin is stronger, right? It's way farther south, closer to the equator, and the air in Austin is drier too. It has a lower relative humidity than the air in Detroit. So all those combined means that even though it's raining more, that rain doesn't necessarily go very far, right? The plants have to use a lot of water to stay alive, right? And also, and so that means that the plants don't get to grow as much. It also means there's less water left over for rivers, right, in Austin once the plants have used it, compared to a place like Detroit or the upper Midwest. So we know in the real world, right, that these non-rainfall factors are important for just like place to place. But then the big question is, are they important for climate change, right? So now what Grace is trying to answer is, are there actually places where even though rainfall is increasing, like river flow is not increasing or even decreasing, right? Because they are getting warmer, or maybe because of other things, like maybe because of things like warmer temperatures allowing more plants to grow, using up more of the water than like less water for the rivers, right? Things other than the temperature.
Right.
Are they actually affecting how things are changing in time? Whereas that example was more just two different places at the same time, where she's doing this harder question of, do we actually see how changes over time have been affected by this or no? Because there's a lot of disagreement within my field about like whether these non-rainfall factors are actually that important, and if so, which ones are important? Like whether they're gonna result in extra water or less water. Even that is not totally clear.
Wow, that is a very intriguing topic.
Right.
So, with like global warming, with the whole entire climate heating up, so would you say that if her research proves to be correct in that these like air temperature factors and other factors impact this water availability,
right,
would you say that with climate change, we would have less water and drought overall?
Well, I don't know which way she's gonna find it, right? I guess parts of she's trying to find out is, is the air temperature effect important, in which case it would be like more drought, right, like less water supplies, or could it be one of these other effects that has the opposite effect? So one of the biggest things that can happen in the other direction is that we also know that as the amount of CO2 in the air increases, that causes plants to need less water. This actually comes from plant biology. I don't know if either of you have taken high school biology yet. So you probably learned in high school biology class about these little openings called stomata or stomates that are on the outsides of leaves, right? They these openings allow the plants eat CO2, right? CO2 is the plant food, it's coming from the air. So the CO2, the plants open their stomates right on their leaf surfaces to get this CO2 into the plant, right? So they can do photosynthesis. But when that stomate opens, water escapes out the stomate. It evaporates out the stomate. That's called transpiration. I don't know if that's a word that they use in high school biology class, but okay, good. So we use it a lot, right? So the idea is that if there's more CO2 in the air, right, actually turns out this is well known in plant biology, that if there's a lot more CO2 in the air, those plant stomates, those plant stomata don't have to open as wide, right, to get the same amount of CO2 in, right? They can get the same amount of CO2 in by opening less. And so if they open less, they're gonna lose less water. Right, and that water loss out the stomates, that's actually the main reason that plants need water, right? It's just to replenish that water loss out of the stomates. It's not the water needed to do the photosynthesis reaction. It's not the water needed to bring nutrients to the soil. It's just to replace the water that the plants are losing every time they open their stomates. So the idea is, if there's more CO2 in the air, right, that means plants don't have to open their stomates as much, right? That means they're not gonna have to take up as much water to replace that lost water. And so that would be less water used by the plants, and that would be more water for the rivers and streams. And so there's a whole school of thought that says that might be the most important process. And so climate change, because of the increased CO2 and the plants needing less water, might actually lead to more water in the rivers and streams. So that would be the opposite of the temperature effect. And there's no consensus on which of these effects are larger, right? Some people really focus on the temperature effect, some people focus on that CO2 plant stomate effect. There's other effects, like another one related to plants, which I think I kind of mentioned before, is that the other thing is that those high CO2 levels, in addition to making the plants use less water, they also just make the plants grow more, right? CO2 is plant food. So in a world with more CO2 in the air, more plants might grow, and then that might cancel out the effect of having each plant use less water. Sure, each plant may be using less water, but if there's way more plants, or if those plants have way more leaves on them, they're way more lush, that's going to mean the plants using more water, and that might cancel that whole thing out. So there's all these different things besides just rainfall changes that might impact how much water actually goes into the rivers and lakes for human use. or how much water goes into the soils, right, for human use, or like how plants do. And there's not a lot of consensus in my field about like which of those are going to win, right? Everybody does have a consensus, of course, right? Like we're warming up the planet right now. We're pouring CO2 into the air that's serving as a blanket for greenhouse gases, warming up the planet. Of course, the planet's warming due to us. But then what that implies for this question of whether which places are going to have more water, which places are going to have less water is still very contested because of all these like, possible ways that it could go down that we were just talking about.
Wow.
So yeah, so we're researching things that are like not well known. Of course, there's a lot of things that are well known, right? And I'm not trying to say that like we don't know anything about like what climate change does. There's tons of things about what climate change does that we know really, really well. But this is one of the things that we don't know, and so that's why we're working on it.
So it sounds like your field is very interdisciplinary. Would you say that, because it sounds like you work with biologists and more, and archaeologists?
Oh yeah, no, I'm not actually working with the biologists, right? Like they were the ones, they know about this, the model stuff, but I don't directly work with them. But I do work with a fair amount of, so I'm working with these archaeologists, and then that's on that side project, right, about like those Bronze Age civilizations. And then, I work with some like hydrologists, which are people who study rivers and streams, right? Some environmental scientists and the like. So I'm fairly interdisciplinary. That's just because I'm interested in this whole climate change and water issue, and then like water is such an interdisciplinary thing, right? I think it lends itself to that. And I think the other reason that I do a lot of this kind of interdisciplinary work is that I'm sitting here in this department. It's not really a department of climate science, right? This building you're in, my colleagues, this is the Department of Earth, Environmental, and Geographical Sciences. And so that's a very broad category. That could be almost anything about the planet could be under the category of Earth, Environmental, and Geographical Sciences, right? So we've got archaeologists in this building. We've got, hard rock geologists who are studying the deep earth, right? We've got oceanographers, we've got environmental scientists, we've got like animal biologists in this department. We have people with huge, very different research interests. And so because I'm here, I end up collaborating with some folks who I might not necessarily be collaborating with if I was in like a department of atmospheric science or, climatology or meteorology or something like that, where I'd just be working with a bunch of other people who study the air and clouds and rain and things like that.
Do you work with like bioinformatics or computer science for these like data models?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So there's a lot of models in my field. I actually don't develop the models very much. Like that's never really been my strong point. I'm much more of a user of the model output. So like a lot of the output of these climate models is just downloadable right from the internet for anybody. And so then like I write some code to analyze that climate model output, or say like my graduate student Grace, who I'm talking about, like she's writing code to analyze sort of these, these past historical patterns of river flow and rainfall change and everything, right? But we're not actually developing the models. So most of the people like me who are just analyzing it are not trained as computer scientists. But when you go to the places where they actually develop these climate models, right? These climate models are these super complicated pieces of computer code with, millions of lines of code that are run on these national, computing centers around the world. There's a lot of computer scientists, right, who are involved in that. That's just not what I do as much personally. I can code some, but I don't have a CS degree or something. Right? I never formally learned coding. I'm all just kind of like this minor amateur self-taught coder, as a lot of scientists are. Right? A lot of scientists can code a little bit, but like never really have formal training. So I'm sure my code's terrible.
So how did you get into like environmental science? Like what was your path into this field?
Oh wow, that's a cool question because it reminds me of how it happened. So I think it was that. So I've always been interested in like geography and travel and places and ecosystems and the environment and stuff like that for like as long as I can remember. Like I was the kid who, like when the family took a road trip, I grew up in the Chicago area and like we had to go down to Florida for 2 weeks every winter to see my mom's parents, my grandparents, right? And I was the middle child, and I was like the kid who was like, yes, we're taking a road trip, and like stare out the window the whole time and like look at all the different ecosystems and trees and highways and state boundaries and stuff and get super excited, whereas my siblings were just like, oh my god, like please kill me, right? But so I've just been fascinated with like geography and travel and ecosystems and plants and trees and stuff since I was really young. And then I also had this separate interest in math and science. It was unrelated to it. I also liked math. And then it was in college that I realized, oh wow, like I took a class in atmospheric science. It was an atmospheric science elective in college. And I realized, oh wow, atmospheric science is a field where you can actually use like math and technical stuff, math and a little bit of physics, to understand what's going on with like plants and trees and rain and clouds and geography and what's where and why it's raining over here and not over there and like what causes rain. And my mind was just blown that there was actually a field that used math and science to understand things outside, beautiful things outside out the window like that. And then I was just hooked, and I ended up taking more and more classes, and actually ended up getting a minor in it in atmospheric science, and then went on to graduate school in atmospheric science. And actually really started out, when I got to graduate school, I really thought I wanted to study like weather systems. I wanted to study like how big mid-latitude storm systems worked, and how air flowed. And then I started realizing that there's all this stuff that like we didn't understand about climate change, and I kind of switched my focus to climate change while I was in graduate school, like age 25, 26 or so. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Right.
What would you say is like the best thing about your job?
Oh wow! I mean, so being a professor, especially now, I'm what's called an associate professor, which means that I just got tenure. I've been working here long enough that I have tenure protection. So that means that now I don't really have to ever worry about being fired, right? It's a bit funny, right? But I can basically I still have to teach my classes, of course, and do research, right? But I don't have to worry about what happens if I technically miss the target, and it's actually pretty flexible. Right, I have the time to shape the job the way I want, right? I can decide what I want to do research on, right? I can decide what I want to teach, and that's pretty cool. So that's by far my favorite thing about being a university professor, is that especially once you get to the stage where I am, you can kind of decide what you want to teach and research. As long as you're teaching and researching something that is of value, right? And you still have to write your annual performance reports, and they have to evaluate you and stuff, right? But you have a lot of flexibility, both in terms of what you research and teach, and like when you do it, right? If it's a day that I'm not teaching and I just don't feel like working, I know I can always take a down day, but I just know I'm going to have to catch up later. All that work's still there. I still have to do it. But it affords a lot of flexibility in your schedule. So that's maybe the best thing about this job.
What would you say is the best thing about the teaching aspect of your job?
Oh, wow. Just like helping students really get insight, right? Seeing that light bulb moment, like when a concept goes off in a student's head, is just really special to me, and always has been. I've enjoyed teaching students for a long time, since way before I ever wanted to become like a university professor. Like in college, I was, for my work-study job in college, I helped tutor math, because I was actually a math major at that point. And so I was like someone who helped students with like their pre-calculus homework, and like their calculus homework and stuff like that in college. And it was just, I loved that job, right? Because I just loved helping the students realize at the moment, oh, I got it, and now I didn't used to get it. And that's still true even now with my teaching here. I just like it when I can bring clarity when there was confusion, right? It's a lot, especially about the environment and climate. It's just a lot of confusion. It's a complicated subject, so I just love helping bring that clarity, and maybe also sort of a sense of empowerment too. Like I want my students to leave my classes feeling empowered that they should do something about climate change, or that it's not just an apocalypse, it's not just this horribly scary thing that they can do nothing about, but that it's interesting, right? There are things that are better and worse about it. There are things you can do, right? Sort of sense of agency, a sense of belonging about it, rather than a sense of just being kind of feeling like everything's just going, haywire, which is often how a lot of them come in.
So what about like the job field in environmental science? Like, is it expanding? Are there more, diverse jobs being made?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know as much, so I'm on more the atmospheric and climate science side, right? I'm more of a climate person. So in terms of jobs in the climate field, right, there's always going to be a lot of government agency jobs, right? Every state needs a state climate office that's staffed by, people who have, climate science education. And then there's huge amounts of federal agencies, right, that hire climate people, right? The Department of Energy, NASA, NOAA, and so forth, right, are all hiring climate scientists. So there's a lot of places sort of in terms of the federal research ecosystem, and also state offices and regional offices too, that employ people with sort of climate degrees. But also, one thing that's starting to happen more recently is that now there's all of these private sector firms that are providing like sort of detailed, bespoke climate change information to like Wall Street banks and insurance companies and stuff, right? Because they need to know what their exposure is. They need to know whether they're going to have to raise the price of their flood insurance or something for Florida, right? So it's become this huge little cottage industry now of these little boutique like climate forecasting firms for Wall Street, for insurance companies that are trying to give them their sense of their climate exposure. And I think a lot of people who work in those jobs do a lot of computer programming, from what I understand. I know a few people who work in those jobs. So that's kind of a new thing. But then there's always sort of the more like just sort of nonprofit and government research employment too. So that's sort of climate in particular. When you zoom out to all of environmental science, then there's all kinds of stuff, right? Because like once you zoom out to environmental science as a whole, as opposed to just climate, right? Then you have people like you've already interviewed, right? People who work for all kinds of city and county departments doing things like, water management, stormwater management, things like that, right? People doing environmental consulting, right? For developers who want to build things, right? They need to know their environmental impact, and that's just this massive field, right? So graduates in environmental science broadly, right, can do lots and lots of things, right? Climate is a little bit more specific.
Right. Now, as you know, we are targeted towards high school and middle school students.
Yeah.
So what would you say are some good things that we can do as at our age to provide for the climate or just help spread the word?
Oh wow, yeah. I often think, because I usually get asked this question by adults, for adults, right? People who are homeowners or who are, own vehicles and things like that, right? So for students, right, for kids and teenagers, I think the biggest thing, right? I know it's going to sound really corny, but I think it's to welcome change and be hopeful, right? And know that when you're adults, right, you don't necessarily have to do things the same way as the prior generation did. Right, it's to keep that sense of hope, that sense of agency. So things like, knowing that in the future, right, we might have a lot of solar power, right? We might have a lot of electric cars, right? We may have a lot of, nuclear plants, right? There's a lot of technologies that, weren't really looked on strongly by the past generation, right? But to embrace those, right? Not be afraid of change. That for that young generation, that might be the biggest thing that I would say, right? Is to know that, right, you may be moving into a world where things look a little bit different than in the past, right, in an effort to use less fossil fuels, right, and to be excited about that, right? Like, there's so much promise, right, in some of these technologies, right, getting electricity from solar, getting electricity from sort of nuclear power, sort of reinvented so it's safer, right, it doesn't have the safety problems that our parents and grandparents' generations experienced, right, getting electricity from geothermal, right, is getting this thing that could be huge if we tapped it. We're just not tapping it very much right now because the generation right now is afraid of all those things, right? When they try to build a new solar farm, you get all these neighbors saying, oh no, you don't build a solar farm near me, right? I don't like that, right? That's next to my property, and that's gonna blah, 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 Whereas I just hope that your generation is a little bit more open to saying, hey, well, we need to do something about this. We don't want to just have this CO2 from these fossil fuels continuing to just pour into our atmosphere unabated and warm the planet, right? We're gonna end up with a lot of things like what we just saw with Tropical Storm Helene, but worse, right? Like that's nothing compared to what could happen in the future, right? If we just keep heating up the planet. So, I think just that sort of being excited about change and about new technologies and new ways of living, right? I think is maybe the biggest thing for your generation. I know that sounds corny, right? But you guys you're not homeowners, right? You're not vehicle owners. You can't. When I talk to adults, I say things like, if you got a clunker of a car, right, think about actually, finally, breaking down and getting the new one that's probably way more fuel efficient than the old clunker, right? Or if you own a home, actually, think about making that investment in better insulation for your home so that you lower your electric bills, you lower your heating bills, and you also use way less energy, right? So things like that. But you guys aren't going to get to make those decisions for some time. So, but maybe cars relatively soon, right?
Yeah.
But you have kind of at your age, right? It may just be used cars and stuff. You don't have a lot of, right? But it's like once in a couple decades when you're actually making decisions related to big energy consuming things that you own, right? To make those wisely, right? Are you gonna go for the sort of, are you going to keep that old appliance until it breaks, right? Or if you get a new one, right, that new one uses way less energy, right? Lowers your home energy bill a lot. Just heard this about dishwashers, right? New dishwashers are way more energy efficient than old dishwashers, right? So wash your dishes just as well, right? But way less power and heat and stuff being used, for example. That's just an example, but you get the idea.
All right, that'll conclude the interview for today. Thank you for your time.
Sounds good.